Hi again, everybody, and welcome to Andrew Explains It All. I'm Andrew Conlog, and I'm your guide to it all, or at least all of it about a particular subject in Arizona history. And today, I'm going to be taking you up a little north of Tucson, kind of halfway north and all the way east in Arizona, next to New Mexico, to a place called the Tonto Basin, or Pleasant Valley. And I'm taking you there because it was the site of the Tonto Basin Feud, or the Pleasant Valley War, which was not only the bloodiest conflict in Arizona history outside of a war-type situation, but it was also the worst feud in U.S. history. Much worse so than the Hatfields and the McCoys, despite what Kevin Costner and the History Channel might want you to think. And how did this worst of all feuds come about? Well, it was between two families. The first family was the Tewksbury family. And the Tewksbury family got started here in Arizona because John, the father of the family, had moved here from California with his Native American wife. And so his children were, as they might pejoratively call it at that time, half-breeds, or as hopefully we'd call it today, mixed race. And the only reason I bring that up here is because some people think that the feud got as bad as it did because of racial issues. And the reason for that is because on the other side, we have the Graham family. And the Graham family, as they'd probably think of themselves, were good old white Mormon stock, and they were led by the eldest brother, Tom Graham, who was, by all accounts, just a nice, simple, easygoing fella until the feud got started, in which he fought the faction led by Ed Tewksbury, the son of John. John had died by the time all this happened. So it was Tom and Ed and their factions versus each other. But how did that get started? It would have surprised people that knew the Tewksburys and the Grahams in years before, because they were actually very good friends. They both ranched cattle in the Pleasant Valley area, and they were such good friends and business partners that they entered into illegal business of cattle rustling. And that was not all that uncommon at the time. Small ranchers, like the Tewksburys and the Grahams were, would steal from bigger ranchers. And at that time, there was no bigger ranchers than a man named James Stinson. He was the cattle baron extraordinaire of the Pleasant Valley area. And obviously, he was pretty upset about people stealing his cattle. So to start with, he sent some of his own rough and tumble types, some of his own cowpokes, to intimidate the Tewksburys and the Grahams. But the Tewksburys and the Grahams got the better of Stinson's guys in a gunfight. And Stinson was obviously pretty upset about this. So he came up with a different plan. He approached the Grahams separately and said that they could sort of become his unofficial range detectives, and he would pay them per head to find all the cattle that the Tewksburys had stolen from him. And so the partnership was split up because of money. And the next thing that happened after that, once they sort of got all the evidence that they needed, was that the Tewksburys were taken to court by James Stinson, and the Grahams testified against the Tewksburys. Now, going to court would have been bad enough because the court was in the county seat, and the county seat was several days' ride away from where everybody lived. So that was annoying in of itself, but then they get there, and the Grahams, who were their old partners in the rustling, are testifying against them. Now, the Tewksburys are eventually acquitted, partly because the Grahams testifying against them when people knew they were cattle rustlers too was kind of fishy, but the partnership had been broken up, and that was sort of the die being cast, as they say. Now, that wasn't the only reason for the feud, and in fact, the feud didn't start immediately after that. Another element was the eternal war in the West between cattlemen and sheepmen. And if you haven't heard of that, cattlemen and sheepmen did not like each other. Part of the reason for that is that the sheep, when they go out and they graze, they eat the whole grass plant. Just eat it all up, and then they leave the whole area barren of any kind of plant matter. Whereas the cows just eat the top part of the grass, and then there's a thriving ecosystem where the cattle can continue to eat. So cattlemen don't like sheep being there, and sheepmen don't like cattle being there just because of the mutual antagonisms. And any kind of mutual antagonism in the Old West is a killing offense, so a lot of people died over cattle and sheep. And the Tewksburys, to get back to our story, had some sheep of their own, and also right around the time the feud got started, they were leasing some of their land for some sheep barons from Flagstaff to raise their livestock. They were called the Daggs brothers, last name Daggs, which is a cool name for sheep guys. And so, not long after the Daggs brothers' sheep came on Tewksbury land, the feud got started. And the first victim was just a nameless shepherd. His name does not survive. He was possibly a Navajo, possibly actually a kid, basically. And he was just found shot dead on the Tewksbury land. And before we get into the escalation of this feud, the next part that we have to talk about is a little kind of sidetrack. The Grahams had developed a new friendship in the meantime while they were falling out with the Tewksburys with a family led by a man named Andy Cooper. His real name was Andy Blevins, but he had changed his name to Cooper because he was on the run from the law in Texas, although he did bring his whole family with him, his brothers and his dad, who was affectionately known as Old Man Blevins. And Andy Cooper, just as a little sidetrack, was a psychopath. He was a crazy guy that liked to kill and harm people. And he especially, but his family as well, the Blevins crew, would be some of the most prolific killers in the feud. And again, they were on the Graham side. And the reason I mention that now is because the next thing that happened in this chain of events was that Old Man Blevins, who was out looking for some stolen horses, went missing and was never seen again. And understandably upset about this, the Blevins folks went out and were looking for him, in addition to some of the other Graham friends. And they came upon a ranch that was owned and lived in by a rancher who was friendly to the Tewksburys. So friendly, in fact, that it turned out that all the Tewksburys were over a visiting when the Blevins came up. And, you know, tough words were exchanged and all the kind of Old West stuff happened. And eventually a gunfight happened, the first, I guess, actual engagement of this war, as you could say. And the Grahams got the worst of it. A couple of them died. Now, some people think that even at this point, it may have not gotten quite as bad as it eventually did, except for the next death that happened, which was little Billy Graham, the youngest of the Graham brothers, only 19 years of age, who's out riding and was shot, probably by Ed Tewksbury. And he was able to ride back to his family's ranch. He kind of had his intestines hanging out, as people said, so that's pretty graphic. Anyway, he gets back with his intestines hanging out, and he tells his brothers very sweetly, you know, I wanted to make sure I got back because then you would have gone looking for me if I died out there and they'd shot you too, and then he died. And Tom Graham sees his sweet baby brother dead, and he kind of has his Batman moment, and it's just like off to the races, the feud is on. And so after that, a group of Graham folks led by Andy Cooper go up to the Tewksbury ranch house. They find John Tewksbury, Ed Tewksbury's brother, and a friend of his out there, and they ambush him and kill both of them. And, you know, Andy Cooper apparently does some psychopath stuff and shoots people in the head and things like that. And then the bloodiest episode of the whole feud happens where the Tewksburys from their ranch house and the Graham folks from out there engage in this long gunfight. Some people say it lasted for days. They were just shooting at each other for days. And there's some legends that have sprung out of this gunfight. Some people say that while the gunfight was going on, John Tewksbury and his friends' bodies were laying out there, and then some wild hogs came up and just started eating the bodies. Yeah, and then there's another little legend that as the hogs are eating the bodies, the wife of John Tewksbury, understandably upset about this, comes down and is like, hey, just quit it for like a second while I bury my husband's body so that it doesn't get eaten by pigs. And the Grahams are like, yeah, okay, and the Tewksburys are like, yeah, okay. So she buries the body and goes back in the house, and the gunfight gets going again. Now, some people think there's a lot more credence to the legend of the hogs eating the bodies than the wife coming out and saving it. So I guess picture the worst version of these events, and that's probably what happened. Anyway, this feud carries on a little less bloody than all those episodes, but still more people dying on the two sides for about 15 years. And it just kind of rolls on like that. At one point, there was a very serious effort to stop it. It was actually by a group of vigilantes of ranchers in the area. They called themselves the Committee of 50, and they were going to kind of Assassin's Creed it and kill all the bad elements just to stop all the murder and the rustling and all that type of thing that was happening. But what was interesting was a lot of the Committee of 50 people were known to be friends of the Tewksburys, and a lot of the people they ended up killing were Graham guys, so it may have just been another Tewksbury effort. So amidst all this, eventually, after the rest of his family is killed, his whole family's dead, and he's the only one left, Tom Graham decides, understandably, that he's had enough, and he leaves alone to Tempe, Arizona. and starts a new life for himself, basically. And about 5 years after he left, which is again about 15 years after the whole thing started, having, I guess, put everything behind him, he's bringing in a cart of goods to town, and then what happens next kind of depends on whose side you support. If you're a friend of the Grahams, he just hears somebody yell out, "Tom, it's your time," and then get shot in the back. Or if you want to put a better spin on it for the Tewksburys, because guess who? It was Ed Tewksbury that shot him. They say that when he yelled out, "Tom, it's your time," Tom kind of like looked over his shoulder like that. And so, you know, for honorableness in terms of the Old West, like Ed Tewksbury didn't actually shoot him in the back. He physically shot him in the back, but like Tom was looking over his shoulder. So it's fine, it's okay. And then Ed Tewksbury killed Tom Graham, and Ed Tewksbury is the last man of either family to live. He is the final person to survive the feud. And it's just a final little follow-up. He did survive that, and he did get acquitted at trial. And he was the only person to live and eventually died of natural causes in this Pleasant Valley War, which, interestingly enough, some people attribute to the reason why it took so long for Arizona, to become a state. And that was because there was a very serious effort at the time of the war for Arizona to become a state, but people back east were reading all these salacious stories about this horrible conflict between these backwoods guys. And, you know, some people weren't real keen on Arizona becoming state. You know, why give 2 senators and at least 1 representative to a place where there was basically nothing by East Coast standards? And so they trumpeted up this story like, look at this violent, horrible place. We can't have them becoming a state. And we didn't until at least 1912. And that might partly be because of the Pleasant Valley War. Well, thanks for joining me to talk about it. And I will see you next time on Andrew Explains It All.